May I have some Polish sausage, please?
Are you Polish?
Well, uh, yes, I am. But let me ask you something. If I asked you for Italian sausage, would you ask me if I was Italian? Huh? If I asked you for German bratwurst, would you ask me if I was German? Huh? If I asked you for a kosher hot dog, would you ask me, am I Jewish? Huh? And if I asked you for a taco, would you ask me if I was Mexican? Would you? Huh? Would you?
Well, no.
No, well, if I asked you for some Irish whiskey, what would you ask me if I was Irish? If I asked you for Canadian bacon, would you ask me, am I Canadian?
No, I wouldn't.
Well, then why did you ask me if I was Polish when I asked you for Polish sausage?
Because you're at a cigar store.
Oh.
Welcome to Career Solutions with David Rawls, your guide to improving the quality of your career. David will share tips for career success, faith-based tips for locating, landing jobs, and succeeding at your work. Join your host, David Rawls, who brings more than 30 years' experience working for GTE and Disney, as he helps you with your career solutions.
Well, good evening. It's so good to have you here. We're in session number 9 tonight. We're sort of on the downhill of this 12-week workshop. We're getting into the sort of the intense stuff. Last week we introduced interviewing, and we talked about some of the interviewing basics. In our session number 9, we're going to go into a little bit more advanced stuff. We're going to talk about how to answer those tough interview questions. And we're going to talk about how to come up with some of the good questions that you need to have for your interviewer. Our scriptural foundation for tonight's session comes out of a couple of Old Testament verses. The first one is out of Genesis 4:9, which reads, "The Lord said to Cain, 'Where is your brother Abel?' 'I don't know,' he replied. 'Am I my brother's keeper?'" That's Genesis 4:9. And then over in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, it reads, "The king said to me, 'What is it you want?' And Nehemiah then writes, 'Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king.'" But we're going to be using both of those as solid foundational verses for some of the things that we're going to be talking about. You're going to get some tough interview questions from many of the interviewers that you face in an interview circumstance. Do you know which questions to expect? And are you well prepared to answer them so that you have success in your interview? I mean, that's really the question. I got a wonderful testimonial not long ago. You know, we've been doing these workshops for many, many years, and this is a testimonial from Kim. She sent this in via email, talking about specifically tonight's session. She said, "I wanted to thank you and the people in the Career Solutions group. I went to many different groups, and you were the last group I visited before securing a new job the very next day. I felt that I finally found the right group to help me. I contemplated not coming to your group last week because I had an interview the next morning. Oh, I'm so glad I did. You went over the 2-minute drill that night. The whole way to my interview the next morning, I practiced mine. I had to give the 2-minute drill 3 times, and it worked. I landed the job. I appreciate the way you cut to the chase and get to the essentials. I'm recommending your group to everybody." And then she goes on to talk about how she made a 40-minute drive, a 40-mile drive to our session, and she was so grateful. That was signed Kim. Well, Kim and so many others. The scripture also tells us, though it costs you all you have, get wisdom and gain understanding. We had a person that came to our session a couple of years ago, and it wasn't until she had been to about 7 weeks of our workshop, 7 weeks in a row. It was in the ending part of December and early January. It was cold. And we found out that she was walking here. She didn't have the money, nor did she have the wherewithal to have a vehicle, and she knew that she needed to get here to find a job. And she wasn't just walking from down the street. The person that volunteered to take her home when we found out that she had walked, and it was about 35 degrees outside, discovered that she lived about 13 miles from here. You see, she had been walking for weeks at night, in the dark, in the middle of winter, and it was a 3-hour walk to the session and a 3-hour walk home. Interestingly enough, we have people that say they can't come to the session because it's 12 or 15 miles away, and gee, could we get a session closer to their home? Well, we'd like to do that, certainly, and that's one of the reasons that we're recording these sessions. But how important is it for you to learn this stuff? And what can be the payback in terms of landing the next best job? Maybe it's a job that pays a little bit more. It's a job that you enjoy so much more. Maybe it's the start of a brand new career that you benefit from for not just weeks or months, but years and years and years. Interviewing is the fulcrum. It's the pivotal point in being successful in this job search. And all these sessions up till now lead us to this session number 9, interviewing 301 and 401. It's so important what we say. It's so important that we know how to say it, and it's so important to know when to say what it is we're going to say. Not in a mechanical way, and not in such a fashion where it doesn't come out as a natural conversational response to the questions that we receive, but nevertheless, we need to be prepared. It's so important that we say the right thing at the right time. We don't want to say the right thing at the wrong time or the wrong thing anytime. You know, Stumpy and his wife Martha, you may have heard this story. Stumpy and his wife Martha always went to the state fair every year. They'd been going for years. They'd been married for decades. And for years, Stumpy used to say to Martha as they were getting ready to go, you know, I'd really like to take that plane ride. They've got the old biplane out there, you know, with the open cockpit, and the pilot takes people up and does some stunts and tricks. And he said, for years, I've wanted to do that, Martha. And Martha always responded the same way. Stumpy, that plane ride costs $10, and $10 is $10. Well, as they were getting ready to go to the fair this year, because they went every year, Stumpy said to Martha as they were getting ready to leave the house, he said to Martha, he said, I'd really like to get on that plane this year. He said, you know, I'm getting kind of old. I'm 71 years old, and if I don't take that plane ride, I may not get another chance. Martha nodded her head and smiled, and then she said, I know, Stumpy, but, you know, that plane ride costs $10, and $10 is $10. Well, they got out to the fair and they paid their admission and they grabbed all their literature and their coupons and got himself a hot dog on a stick. And Martha's trying to put all of her stuff back in her purse. And so while all that's going on as they come through the gate, Stumpy sort of steers her without her knowing it. He sort of steers her, and just in a few minutes they're standing over there next to that biplane. And Stumpy says, look, Martha, here's the biplane. I think I ought to get on that. And Martha says, I know you want to ride that plane, Stumpy, but that plane ride costs $10, and $10 is $10. Well, the pilot overheard them. He came over and introduced himself, and he said, I'll tell you what I'll do. He said, I know that you're concerned about the money. How about this? He said, I'll take you both up together, and as long as you don't say a word, it'll be a free ride. But if either one of you lets out a peep, it'll be $10 apiece. What do you say? Well, Martha and Stumpy looked at each other and they nodded, and so they agreed. They all got in. All three of them got in. The pilot took off. As soon as he got up to altitude, he started doing tricks. He started doing barrel rolls and loop-de-loops and power-off stalls, and then he started doing dives and all kinds of fancy stuff, trying to get one of them to scream out. Not a word. So the pilot, a little concerned, he went back through all of his tricks again. He wanted the $20, and so he went through the barrel rolls and the dives and another 10 minutes in the air. Again, not a peep. They land the plane. The pilot turns around and says to Stumpy, he said, I am absolutely amazed that one of you didn't make a sound, a scream, a screech, something. Stumpy said, well, I was going to say something when Martha fell out, but $10 is $10. See, we have to know when to talk and when to be quiet. And that's certainly true in interviews as well. This is the way some of our interviewers approach the interview situation. As a matter of fact, I would say most job seekers approach interviews this way. Is that kind of that ready, fire, aim thing? There was actually a book title by this name many, many years ago. Ready, fire, and then maybe to take aim, and of course you miss your target so many times when you do it that way. This is a lot about preparation, of course. It says in Proverbs 18:13, he who gives an answer before he hears, it is folly, and shame on him. God wants us to listen closely to the question and then answer it appropriately. And so many times we're ready with an answer before we even know what's being asked. And I assure you, as we talk about some of the examples tonight, it's not just the words that are being used, but we're going to have to learn to listen between the lines, just like we read between the lines. Remember that tough question that God asks back in Genesis 4:9. He said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? Well, if you know the story, of course, Cain had already slew his brother. He'd killed Abel. What a tough interview question that would be. And we all get tough interview questions, maybe not quite that tough, but we get tough interview questions nevertheless. Now, I might ask that we perhaps if we were in a little bit different environment, we might break up into small groups and brainstorm, and we might talk about some of the toughest interview questions that you can get, at least in categories of questions. And I'm going to tell you what previous groups have shared so that we can get these captured, of course, on this video. One of the kinds of questions that we get all the time that a lot of job seekers would hope to avoid is, tell me about your biggest weakness. Or tell me about a time when you failed. Or tell me about a time when you didn't do what you were supposed to do. A lot of different ways to ask the question to get you to admit to some fallacy, some time when you tripped and stumbled and how you responded to. How about this? This is always a tough question. Tell me about your worst boss and what you didn't like about them. Or tell me about a conflict that you had with a fellow employee that didn't turn out so well. How about this one for those of you that have been out of work for a while? Tell me, can you explain why you've been out of work so long? How about that for a loaded question? I mean, that would put you on the defensive when the word long just sort of lingers out of their mouth. Or here's one, a tough one, right? This is a right-in-your-face question that some interviewers will ask, and they might ask you at a time when they can catch you off guard. Tell me, why should I hire you? And they expect an answer. And they expect a well-thought-out, good answer. They expect you to know why they should hire you, which means you need to know something about yourself, and you also need to know something about them and how those things match up. How about this one? Reflect on, these behavioral interview questions I think sometimes throw people. Reflect on a difficult individual in the workplace. How did you deal with that person? In other words, on a behavioral level, what did you do? What was your response? What actually occurred? What took place? You have to learn how to tell stories about what's going on over the course of different events that you experienced in your work life. Tell me about a time when your integrity was challenged and what you did about it. It's one thing to talk about the difficult challenge. It's another thing altogether to talk about how you handled it and how you worked your way through it. Now, let me tell you, one of the worst answers that you can give when you get a question like that is, well, that's never happened to me, because that's just not true. It's happened to all of us, perhaps to some to greater or lesser degrees, but we all have those experiences that were less than comfortable. Now, as a foundation for how we deal with these tough questions, we need to be thinking along these lines. Our great answers are really going to consist of us stepping through 3 quick steps in a process. Thinking back on that ready, fire, aim model, which is clearly incorrect, the first thing we want to do is listen, and we want to listen with care. We've heard the term do something carefully, but I want to talk about that for just a few seconds. We want to listen with care. We're going to listen with our ears, Talked about this in the last session. We're also going to listen with our eyes, because we know a lot of what is heard is not the oral part, it's not the auditory part, it's the body language that's going on as well. It's when somebody answers with words and the body language doesn't match, there's some kind of communication challenge going on here. So, and the third, ears, eyes, we want to listen with our heart. We want to hear the heart of the person that's communicating, which is almost hearing the motivation and the person behind the words and the answer. And as an inner viewer, they're going to be asking questions that they've decided in advance are important to ask. We need to be listening to those with our heart so that we get the motivation behind the question. Because let me assure you, there's many questions that you're going to be asked that are going to be well-intentioned. It's information they want, but they're not asked well. And I'm going to share with you several examples where you have to almost learn how to interpret the questions on the fly. It's not nearly as difficult as it sounds. Once we understand or believe we understand the question, we actually have to engage for a couple of nanoseconds in having our brain formulate something before we start spewing out of our face. So speaking is the third step. It's not the first one. So we want to think, of course, with purpose. We want to think about not just the words were used, but what are they getting at? What's the spirit of the question? See, if we answer the literal words of the question and we miss the spirit of what they're after, we miss the boat. We miss winning the prize. Even though they may misask the question, they expect us to answer the question they intended, not always the question that came out of their mouth. Is that fair? No, but that's the way they evaluate your responses. And then we can speak, the third step, with impact. We can speak fully, knowing exactly what it is that's going to be powerful for us in making a connection with our interviewer. We need to be in all of our responses. I don't use absolute a lot, but when I do, I really want to accentuate it. In all of our answers, three things need to occur. Number one, we need to be truthful. Always truthful. God is not going to honor deceit, either by commission or by omission. If we think we can get around something by leaving it out, that's not going to be honored. Number two, we need to make sure that we're concise. We need to have a good economy with words. Sometimes you ask somebody a question, and the answer goes on and on and on. And I mean, I have to watch myself. I'm a teacher, and you ask me a question that's an open-ended question, I've got a 2-hour answer. But I know many times that's not what you want. You want the abridged version. You want the short version. And that's certainly true when we're sitting in interviews. They don't have all day to spend with one candidate in most circumstances. So we want to be economic with our use of words, and we want to be positive. We want to be positive not only in terms of the response of the words, but we want to be positive in our demeanor. We want to smile. We want to be energetic. We want to be enthusiastic. We want to be animated. If you're a fairly unanimated person, then get some shock treatment. Do something to get animated. I used to, when I worked on the Jungle Cruise at Disneyland, forgive this silly story, it's a true story, we used to say to people when they got off the boats, and there'd always be someone on our boat as we took the trip around, there'd always be somebody who was just we were, quite frankly, we would always wonder why this person even came to Disneyland. They clearly weren't having any fun. And so I would say when I had a particularly old curmudgeon sitting there who just seemed to frown all the entire trip around with all of my funny stories and all the entertainment going on and everybody else enjoying themselves, they're just, grouchy. So I would always include this at the end of that spiel when they were getting off the boat. For those of you that are having trouble smiling today, remember one thing. If you go to sleep with a coat hanger in your mouth, you'll wake up with a smile on your face. Every once in a while, it would cause that one person to finally smile. They needed to hear something just that off the wall. Truthful, concise, and positive. I want to perhaps reinforce the concise part with this little quote from Mark Twain. He said, if you tell the truth, you never have to remember anything, and the truth is always shorter than the story. And here, this is coming from a great storyteller. Just tell the truth. Say it like it is. Now, this whole thing, if you think of all these, you could kind of draw a circle around all this, and maybe there's a fourth part of this process that isn't part of the process, but it is. And that is, I draw a circle around these three things in my book, and we have to bathe this whole process in prayer continually. I shared that Nehemiah verse. I think I shared with you last week in our session about Annabelle and how she learned how to pray before the interview, during the interview, literally between the questions, and how that gave her the power and the confidence as she sat through the interview to give powerful, short, concise, truthful, and impacting answers. So bathe that in prayer. Now, one of the things we have to do when we're listening, of course, is we have to make sure that we're listening with our eyes. I mentioned that. I want to share this story. The Lone Ranger and Tonto were camping in the desert. Some of you are old enough to remember the Lone Ranger and Tonto, his Indian friend. They set up their tent, and they're fast asleep. Some hours later, the Lone Ranger wakes his faithful friend. He says, "Tonto, wake up, Tonto, wake up. Look up in the sky and tell me what you see." Tonto immediately replies, "Me see millions of stars." "What does that tell you?" asked the Lone Ranger. Now, I know this is hard to conceive that Tonto would respond this way, but just go with me on the story, okay? Tonto says, "Astronomically speaking, it tells me that there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. Astrologically, it tells me that Saturn is in Leo. Time-wise, it appears to be approximately 3:15. Theologically, it's evident that the Lord is all-powerful and we are but small and insignificant. Meteorologically speaking, it looks like we're going to have a great day tomorrow. What does it tell you, Kemosabe?" which was his pet name for his friend, the Lone Ranger. "What does it tell you?" The Lone Ranger is silent for a moment, and then he responds, "Tonto, someone has stolen our tent." You see, Tonto gave a correct answer. As a matter of fact, he elaborated beautifully on all the salient points of his answer. But that wasn't the point of the Lone Ranger's question. "Look up in the sky, tell me what you see." "I see stars." "What does that mean?" "Our tent's gone." That's what it means. And quite frankly, men, and I'm speaking to most of the men now, we're not nearly as observant, perhaps, as we ought to be. We need to be more observant, particularly in an interview. So with that in mind as our foundation, these are the 6 categories of questions that a lot of people struggle with, and I'm going to name them each for you, and then I'm going to go through them in some detail. The first category of questions are the icebreaker questions. Those are usually the ones that come up at the front. They're called icebreakers because it's the questions that many interviewers are taught that you ask your candidates up front to put them at ease so that they feel comfortable answering the rest of your questions. And so icebreakers come right at the beginning. We'll deal with those first. And then there's the performance kinds of questions. These are the questions where questions that are related to how well you did something or didn't do something. And there may be several different ways and several different categories of these. You'll see some examples of those in a minute. And then there's the qualification questions. This is the stuff that you bring to the party. They may be requiring certain kinds of experiences or a certain length of time of experience or certifications or educations, degrees or diplomas. What are the qualifications that you bring to the game here? And some people don't like to deal with those because they don't always have all the qualifications necessary based upon the way that job description was written. And then we get into some tougher ones. There's the personality questions. Yes, this is all about our temperament, and these get to be a little bit squishy and sometimes a little bit nerve-wracking because we're not always sure what they're looking for. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then the questions about the future. What I discovered when I was a recruiter for many, many years and interviewing job seekers, what I discovered is the majority of people haven't really thought about long-term what they plan to do. And we'll talk about some of those future-oriented questions and how we need to be prepared for those and how those might be put to us and what some of them really mean. And then the toughest category of questions for some people is this last category, the money questions. Some of you know why they ask the money questions, and the money questions can be very unnerving. And how do we respond to those effectively without causing ourselves to be immediately taken out of the running? We're going to talk about that as well. Now let us remember 1 Peter 3:5. 1 Peter 3:5. And I might commend you to go back and study this verse and think about this verse every time you sit down and prepare or not for an interview. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts and be ready always to give an answer to every man. We're basically supposed to live our lives that way. We're supposed to be able to represent and respond in the right, positive way about who we are, what we do, what we're headed for, what our values are. We need to be able to represent ourselves and God's kingdom, and we need to be well prepared in those answers. This isn't something where we just shoot off the cuff, as it were. All right, let's walk through each of these in detail. The icebreaker questions. Now, the icebreaker questions, these are the getting to know you questions. These are, as I said, these are the ones that are intended to kind of warm things up, put you at ease, maybe even put you a little off guard so that you're not quite as concerned about what you're willing to talk about. And the most oft used question in any interview, and we've talked about this when we got into the resume section. We talked about the oral resume. We talked about this last week, and I want to reinforce it again tonight. The most frequently asked question is, tell me about yourself. Absolutely. Tell me about yourself. And it's oftentimes in just those same words. Tell me about yourself. 4 words. But there's many, many possible variations of that. They might ask the question, tell me what brings you here today, or they might say, looks like you've been in a search for a long time. How does that square up with all of your background? Again, these are kind of overarching, big, broad, the biggest, broadest general questions you can get. What caused you to be seeking work? Let's hear a summary of your background. Now, there's a lot of given reasons why job interviewers ask these questions. There are some interviewers that would say, well, I asked them because it's a good icebreaker question. It allows the job seeker to sort of settle down. But there's a lot of other icebreaker questions used for that. Did you have any difficulty finding our office this morning? How have you been doing since we set up the interview? I mean, basically small talk stuff. They're expecting something significant when they ask the question, tell me about yourself. This is not a throwaway question. As a matter of fact, I want you to write this down. This is the best question you could be asked in an interview. I've said for years, about 90 to 95, maybe as much as 99% of the interviewers ask this question. We know it's almost all of them. It almost always comes at the beginning. If it's not the first question, it's one of the first couple. And it's the greatest opportunity you have to make a huge first impression. We talked about it in the resume, but I'll reiterate by way of review here. When are we most nervous in an interview? At the very beginning. 73% of all interviewers, according to one survey, make up their mind in the first 10 minutes, which means we may need to make a dynamite first impression. First impressions are typically made at first. Very seldom do we get a second chance to make a first impression. So we're nervous, we need to make a good first impression, and already said, 90%, 95, maybe 99% of the interviewers ask the question. So most of us know, and if you've been out interviewing, you know this is being asked. If you know you're going to be asked for this question over and over and over and over and over and over again by almost every interview, why wouldn't you prepare a compelling, powerful, dynamite answer? I don't know what some job seekers are waiting for. I guess maybe they think if they practice this and blow it in enough interviews, they'll finally get their act together. I'm suggesting that you put it together and practice it with friends and strangers so that when you get into your interview, you've got a dynamite first answer for that first question. Tell me about yourself. We talked last week about how powerful it is in terms of controlling where the interview goes, so I won't spend time raking over those coals, but we know the value in having this answer. First impressions. Dictating where the rest of the interview goes. That's our best first answer. Knowing it, getting it down cold, rehearsing it with people. We had somebody practice their 2-minute drill in here, which is what we call the answer to that question, a few sessions ago. And we evaluated how well that 2-minute drill was delivered and the components that are the 4 parts that are in the 2-minute drill. If you do a good job with that, you're going to get off to a great start. It's like getting out of the blocks fast in a race. That's not the whole race, and yes, you got to be fast and you got to finish strong all the way through the race. But boy, what an advantage you have when you get off to a great start, and it's just going to add so much to your confidence level. When are we most nervous? At the beginning. If you know most of the time what your first question is and you know you've got your answer ready, there's so much less reason to be nervous. You're just going to have that quiet confidence that comes with knowing. And then every once in a while, about 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 or 1 out of 50 interviewers that doesn't ask that question, you're going to be disappointed that you didn't get it because you got the answer ready. So I always tell people, try and work that answer in the first 5 minutes to some kind of question. If they give you a broad enough question, you give your 2-minute drill. Let's go on to the second category of questions. Oh, let me share this. This is another piece of feedback. I got this back from a senior hospital administrator. Jim is his name. I think you'll be interested in this. He says, and this you'd have to know Jim to appreciate most. He says, I'm a broken down hospital administrator. He's not broken down at all. With over 30 years of experience, throughout my career, I've tried countless interviews. I've hired countless interviews of employees, although mostly at the executive level. Well, I thought I pretty much knew it all. That was before I came to Career Solutions, when I was humbled at how out of date my ideas were and how much I didn't know. You helped me realize that my Achilles heel was my inability to network. He goes on about networking, and then he says, thank you for your help. I used my 2-minute drill during the interview, complete with a closing question. I politely declined to discuss the money question. We'll talk about that later. During the first interview, they brought it up. And I also did not discuss the money during the second interview. They brought it up again. We did discuss salary, and I negotiated some other benefits when the offer was made. It's my humbled opinion that those who are attending Career Solutions will closely follow the techniques that you teach during each session. They will be well prepared for anything that happens in the interview process. Well, I've helped thousands of people. I know that to be true. Not because I'm an expert. This isn't about what I do or what I know. This is about what you do to prepare. What I know isn't going to help you be any more successful than you'd be if you hadn't come in here. It's what you do with this information. The Lord tells us in the Bible, don't be just hearers of the word, be doers also. The power comes in doing what you learn. The power comes in the application of what you know, not just in knowing it. Again, it's so important what we say. You've probably all heard various versions of this story about the man in the hot air balloon who was lost. He spotted a woman down below. He said, "Excuse me, can you help me?" He said, "I promised a friend I'd meet him here an hour ago, but I don't know where I am." The woman below replied, "Well, you're in a hot air balloon hovering approximately 30 feet above the ground. You're between 40 and 41 degrees north latitude, between 59 and 60 degrees west longitude." "You must be an engineer," shouted the balloonist. "Well, I am, but how did you know?" she said. "Well, everything you told me is technically correct, but I have no idea what to make of your information, and the fact is I'm still lost. Frankly, you've not been much help so far." "You must be in management," she shouted back up to the balloonist. "I am, but how did you know?" "Well, you don't know where you are or where you're going. That was my first clue. You've risen to where you are due to a large quantity of hot air. That was my second clue. You made a promise which you have no idea how to keep, and you expect people beneath you to solve your problems. That was my third clue. The fact is, you're in exactly the same position you were before we met, except now somehow it's my fault." You see, sometimes we answer someone's question giving them what they ask for rather than what they need. We need to be thinking about what they need, what they're shooting for. Remember, I said we have to learn how to listen between the lines, just like we read between the lines. Let's talk about the performance questions. These are the "what can you do for me" kinds of questions. They want to know how you behave, how well you did things. Remember when we talked about resumes several sessions back, we talked about how employers don't just want to know what your responsibilities were, they want to know how well you did with those responsibilities. Don't tell me you answered the phone, tell me how good you were at answering the phone. Don't tell me you traveled around the world selling things, tell me how well you sold and who you sell and how much you sold. Let's talk about the qualitative and quantitative achievements that you have. That's what these performance questions are all about. They might ask them this way: what are your greatest strengths? Or they'll flip it over and comes that weakness question. Tell me about your greatest weaknesses. What are some of your greatest accomplishments? Tell me about the results, the best results you had in your last job. What successes have you been most proud of? What has your boss complimented you for? The last four bosses, pick out something that each of those last four bosses liked about your performance most. Now, you can't blow those questions off, and some sort of a half-hearted, a slough-off answer ain't doing the trick. You have to answer these with power. Remember what I said early on, we're listening not only with our ears, but we're listening with our eyes, we're watching the body language, we're listening with our hearts. Let me tell you what almost all of these questions mean. And when you get these performance questions, write this down, because this is what you need to be translating to. They want to know how I can fill their needs. When somebody says, "What is your greatest strength?" or somebody says, "What is your greatest accomplishment?" that is not what they're asking. Get this. This is worth the price of admission. This could be worth $20, $50, $100, or $500,000 a year in lifetime earnings, if you just get this. When somebody says to me, "What's your greatest accomplishment?" and I say, "Well, I think back and in my own mind," and forgive me for using this example, but I have fun with it. I guess in my last 3 jobs, I was able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. Superman. We're really proud of that answer. We've been complimented by several people. And so we give them that answer. I leaped tall buildings in a single bound. I leaped a whole bunch of them. My last boss was tickled to death. And then we find out 2, 3, 4 weeks later that somebody else got the job. And then by accident, we find out the person they hired is faster than a speeding bullet. And you say to yourself when you find out, well, you know, I'm faster than a speeding bullet too. I'm Superman. But I don't consider that my greatest strength. That isn't what I was complimented most on in my last job. But see, the point is you're not interviewing for your last job. You're interviewing for this job, and you needed to find out before you went in the interview that what they were looking for was people that were fast. They weren't looking for people that could jump high. So when they ask you the question, what's your greatest strength? What's your greatest accomplishment? You need to translate that to, what is my greatest accomplishment that can be applied in this job? And that's what your answer needs to consist of. And if you don't make that translation, you're going to be the second place winner. You're going to come in second or third place with no matter what else you say in the interview or how good you are, no matter how good you look or how many technical credentials you have. If they're looking for somebody who's fast and you're a leaper, you missed the target. Oh, you're a good candidate. But boy, if we're ever looking for somebody that can leap buildings, we're going to call you back. That usually means never. So you've got to translate those questions. How can you meet their needs? Now, what does that imply? We talked a little bit about this last week and in previous sessions. You've got to learn their needs. And this is more than a 5-minute conversation. I tell everybody, you don't go out on an interview for an hour or an hour and a half interview unless you're spending 90 plus minutes in preparation. Learning this stuff about the interviewer and about the employer and about the job. What are the requirements of the job? If you can't find it online, and by the way, there was a time when none of us could find it online because there wasn't an online. Al Gore hadn't invented it yet. But now that stuff is out there in a lot of places. But let me assure you, it hadn't changed so much over the last 50 years. You've been able to ask the question. Just ask people what's required in the job. If you can't get to the boss, ask the HR screener. If you can't get to them, call somebody else in the department that works in that job and ask them what the job is. You ask enough people and you'll find out what's in the job. Might it take a little bit of time? Yes. Is it worth the energy? I'll guarantee you it is. I've seen people move from the back to the front of the line and get a job offer because they went to the trouble to spend 90 or 120 minutes in preparation for an interview. And they knew how to answer these questions with power. They weren't the best candidate. They were the best suited for that job in terms of what they were able to answer in the questions. I've landed 4 great jobs in my life in 3 different employers. And I've never been the best candidate. But just so you know, the best candidate, whatever that means, technically the best, credentialed the best, it seldom is that the person who gets hired. It's the person that knows how to answer the right question. It's the person that knows how to listen between the lines. It's the person who does the research so that their answers can be powerful. Qualification questions. I gave you a variation on this a little while ago. Why do you believe that you're qualified for this job? Why should we hire you in this job? What have you done to prepare for this kind of position? Or how about this one? This one throws a lot of job seekers, particularly mid-career people. Aren't you a bit overqualified for this job? I hate that overqualified question. Some of you do too. I know you do. By the way, it's not a bad question. How we deal with it is important. Again, listening with our ears and our eyes and our hearts, we want to get into the motivation. What's behind these questions? The first thing we know is, they want, in terms of the qualification questions, the preparation questions, what have you done to get ready for this? In terms of your education, certifications, years of experience, apprentice programs, stepping up through the ranks, growing up into getting ready for this, all those preparatory things, books you've read, classes you've taken, seminars you've been to, they want to know what are the tools that you have in your toolbox that will help you succeed. This is a toolbox question. Why should I hire you? Start thinking about your tools. Start thinking about those accomplishments. These are generally credential questions, and the interview wants to know what you have. What are the tools that you've been able to accumulate in your toolbox that will contribute to your succeeding in the job. If you're out there interviewing as a carpenter and you don't have your own tool belt, let alone all the stuff that goes in it, you're going to have a hard time getting hired as a carpenter. They're looking for the man or woman that comes to that interview with their tool belt already strapped around their waist. So what are the tools that you bring to that job? You need to sit down and take an inventory of the tools. Some of them are very tangible and some of them are very intangible, but what are all those things? And let's say that one of the tools that they require, one of the credentials that they want is a 4-year college degree, and you don't have that. Let me address that right now, okay? It can be this tool or other tools, but let me address the education thing. Every single company that has jobs that require an education, I'll bet that over a period of time, every single one of those jobs has been filled by someone who did not have that education. There's been an exception made for every one of them. And if there hasn't been yet, there will be. So I want you to know that you should not automatically allow yourself to be knocked out because you don't have the education requirement. But there's a condition to the response I just gave you. You got to have something in its place. They don't say, well, you don't meet any of our qualifications, but you carry yourself well and you got a nice smile. That doesn't replace that qualification. We had a senior executive in my company, which was a Fortune 25 firm. It required a college degree just to become a junior executive. This young lady became not only an executive, she became a senior executive. Didn't have 1 hour of a college education. Why? Because she had so much more. She had a breadth and a depth of experience exceeded most of the men she competed against for the job. Now, if the men wanted to keep her out, they certainly could have kept her out because of the educational credential, but they hired the best person for the job when they put her in there. She was an exceptional leader and executive in the organization. She didn't have a stitch of college. And you can probably make that same sort of comparison or analogy to almost any qualification. There are probably alternatives that would enable you to get the job. It might be 10 additional years of experience or something else, depending upon the kind of job that it is. The best answer for these questions, your preparation questions, is the best answer, if we're going to speak with impact, remember they want to know what our credentials are. They want to know what we can apply to the position. Start out with a broad general question. If you know some of the credentials that they require, let me just give you an example. All of my background, my work experience, my educational background has prepared me for this position. And then you ask a question. Can you, presuming you don't know, you don't ask this question if you already know the answer, can you tell me what your ideal candidate looks like? And see, they may have stated in their job description or in their job posting or maybe in some other introduction, you may have heard what incumbents are required to bring to the party in terms of credentials. But this hiring person may have something else in mind altogether, and you need to find out what their view of the needed credentials are as you're sitting across from them. Then once they can give you some of the specifics, you've got to see what you have that either fills that or something that you have that you can substitute for something they're looking for. Now let me deal with the overqualification issue for just a second because I know it plagues many mid-career people. First off, let me say this, and there's exceptions to almost everything I say, and so there's certainly an exception to this statement. But most of the time, you do not need to take a step back because you've been laid off or fired. Some people say, well, I've been out of work for 10 months. I've been out of work for 18 months. So I've sort of lowered my expectations. Sometimes lowering your expectations can make it even harder to find a job. The kind of job that you're qualified to do is not necessarily time sensitive in the sense that the lower the level job, the easier it is to find. That is not a true statement. The easiest job to find is the one that you're perfectly matched and suited to do, not one that's down here. But let's say you get the overqualification question. I'll talk about my friend Larry, who came through this workshop. I had known him many years before. He had worked his way up the corporate ladder. He had a fairly responsible position. He was working 60, 70 hours a week, and right smack in the middle of his career, he came into our workshop and he says, Dave, I'm stepping back. I want to step back in responsibility. I want to get some of my life back. My kids are getting to the age now where I'm going to, if I don't start spending some time at home, I'm going to miss their entire growing up. So he intentionally stepped back. He got the same question as he was applying for jobs. Aren't you a bit overqualified? Aren't you a bit overqualified? If they ask the question, know one thing, write this down. If they ask the question, are you a bit overqualified? The reality is this. If you're overqualified, you're qualified. That ought to be perhaps part of your first answer. By you're implying that I'm overqualified, what you're saying is you believe I have all of the capabilities of doing the job. Get an affirmation there. Get them shaking their head, yes. They don't even have to verbalize it. Just get them to do this. And then here's what you need to deal with. When somebody asks the overqualification question, they're really not concerned about your qualifications at all. What are they concerned about? They're concerned about the risk of hiring you that you won't stay. But I don't think I bumped into one job seeker in 1,000 who understands that and ever really answers the intended question. When they say, aren't you overqualified? The translation of that is, if I hire you, are you going to leave me in 3 months if you find something better? Answer that question. If the answer is yes, answer the question yes. I'm not advising that you lie so you can get a job. But if you're like Larry and you're stepping back intentionally because you like this particular employer, this is the kind of work you were most comfortable doing, you didn't feel suited doing that last job, you were under a lot more stress, I'm not trying to give you some fabricated answer. You got to give them the answer that fits who you are. And if you're applying for a job less than the job you applied for, the answer is probably yes or no. Are you overqualified? Yes, I am, which means I'm qualified. But let me talk about the fact that you seem to be concerned about whether or not I'll stick around. In Larry's case, I coached Larry and I said, just tell them that you have no intention of taking another job with the same level of responsibility or income, period. This is an intentional career change. Now, my friend John, he used to recommend years ago, and I've seen this work twice. Now, I'm guessing it's happened more, I just haven't got feedback about it, but it's happened twice, where you just say to the potential boss, let me prove to you, if I may, that my intentions are not to try and find something better and leave, and if something better comes along in 2 months or 3 months or 6 months, my intention is to rekindle and restart my career right here. Now, I may not want to stay in this job for 10 more years, but I'm not out looking, this is not a stopgap till I find something better. And I want to prove it to you. I'm going to suggest to you that you take 10 or 15% of my gross income. Take it right off the top, set it aside. Don't even give it to me. Matter of fact, I want you to do that for 2 years. And if I leave for any reason, you keep the money. If I don't leave, I expect the money plus interest. I want you to put it in an account for me. I'm just willing to put my money where my mouth is. Now, the reality is, there's probably not many places that would do that. And I'm not even sure that the law would allow it. I guess if you hired them as a contract employee, you could probably make that part of the contractual agreement. But most employers are not going to go to the trouble. Here's why you need to say that kind of statement. It's a heart thing. It's a heart thing. We want them to hear your heart. Again, don't say this unless you mean it. you're just worried about qualifications and they're worried about risk, let them know that you're going to be a good employee for them because of what you bring to the party in terms of your overqualification. You bring maturity, you bring wisdom, you don't have to be trained, you can hit the ground running, they'll get an immediate return on their investment when they hire you that they don't always get when they hire trainees. Okay, our next category of questions is the personality questions. These are the what makes you tick kinds of questions. I mean, what's going on inside? What makes you unique among so many others? You'll get questions like, what did you like or dislike about your last job or your last boss? If you could pick the ideal position, describe that. You might get a question like, what duties did you enjoy most or did you enjoy least? You always get those extreme kinds of questions. And this you get into the people sort of interface questions like conflicts. What kind of conflicts might you've had with others? You get some behavioral interview questions like, describe a time when you had a conflict and how that ultimately came to be resolved, if ever. If you saw someone stealing from the company, what would you do? And of course, I know the first inclination for all of us is to say to ourselves quickly, how do they want me to answer? And I would say as an interviewer, I would want you to answer honestly. Because see, if your value system, if everything you are doesn't fit who we are, you won't last long. Because I was talking with a job seeker probably 2 weeks ago. And this job, he was constantly looking for answers to questions on how he could best pitch himself. And I said, you're missing the point. I mean, when we talked about the Superman example, you want to decide whether you're going to sell this part of you or that part of you, but what you sell needs to be you. When you get into the values questions, there's not a lot of wiggle room there. I remember when I interviewed the first time I interviewed for the vice president of HR position, I was preparing all of my answers for the CEO. I knew I had an interview coming up in about a week. I'd known this man for several years. I knew what his values were. I knew the kind of person that he was. My boss, who was retiring, whose job I was interviewing to fill, had worked for this man, and I'd gotten secondary feedback about him from my boss for several years. And so I was trying to prepare my answers so that I would fit with him, and then it dawned on me about 10 days before the interview, I'm trying to prepare answers to be someone I'm not. If he doesn't want who I am, yes, I want to put my best foot forward. I want to smile when I want to be energetic. I want to talk about the credentials that I have that are most meaningful for him. But when he gets to the core of me, when he gets to my values, I got to give him who Dave Rawls is. I didn't get the job because I didn't fit with him. If you saw somebody stealing from the company, what would you do? Don't ask, how should I answer this? Ask yourself in advance, what would you do? What would the Bible have you do? What would God honor you with in terms of your behavior? In terms of the overall likes questions, what are some of the jobs you like, the people you like, and so forth, you're usually safer. Again, you've got to be honest, but you're usually safer if you can use broader, generalized terms. I'm not asking you to be dishonest at all, but you can use broader, generalized terms about yourself. Usually things that are not quite as debatable. Things like, for example, if somebody said, what did you like most about your last job? I mean, I could answer that with 15 different answers about what I really loved about my job. I loved a lot of things about it. But one of the things I love that I know is going to be fairly undebatable, by, or indebatable, whatever the right word is, for most potential employers would be, the thing I loved about the job was that I had the opportunity to contribute to the success of the organization. I'm not talking about duties. I'm not, I really like to travel instead of the phone. I really like not having to go to meetings. If you're interviewing with a boss who has a lot of meetings, that could be a dangerous end. So I'm being true to my values. And one of the things that I really loved about my last job was I really loved the fact that I was able to contribute to the success of the organization. I didn't feel like just some unnecessary cog in the wheel. It kind of says who I am, and it also tells the boss that this person wants to contribute. It tells the boss that this person needs to know whether or not they're contributing. And I wouldn't want them to hire me if they're going to put me in a back room and lock the door and I'm never going to get any feedback, because everything I do stays inside the room. It never goes into the rest of the company or eventually gets to the customer. It's basically an unnecessary task, and there are companies that have unnecessary jobs. That wouldn't be for me. Here's one. When you get the dislikes questions, now here's where you need to be careful. And this is where I think you need to do a little bit of translation. Now, what did you dislike about your last boss? Or what did you dislike about your last employer? And here's where I'm going to ask you to think seriously about giving this kind of answer. Do your best, and I believe this is a biblical approach. Do your best to never dish anybody or any organization. If the question comes, tell me about your last boss, and believe me, or your worst boss, I can talk about my worst boss in the most favorable of terms. The worst boss I ever had is the worst boss. As an HR executive, I had to work with, coach and counsel and work with a lot of bosses in the organization. And some of them weren't all that good. But I worked for the worst one I ever saw in action in my 31 years in corporate America. And I worked for this person for a year. And yet, when I'm asked about that individual, my response is, the person was a significant challenge for me in many ways because our values were different. But the thing that I remember most about that relationship, and by the way, this is a true statement, that I remember because I've caused myself to remember this. I remember when I got my annual performance review, I saw the best performance review performed by a boss that I had ever seen in my life. I thought I gave good performance reviews for subordinates. I learned a whole bunch of good stuff. I was really impressed by the process. So even though there were many things about this person's leadership that I would not emulate, that I would not recommend, and I don't really want to badmouth this person, I try to remember if you can't think of something good to say, then think of something neutral to say. That's my advice on the best answers to the dislikes questions. Or things that are pretty much going to be undebated. What are some of the things you disliked about your last company? Well, it's not going to be too undebatable or too debatable. For example, if you were to say things like, well, one of the things that I disliked was the unproductive meetings. I don't know how many people would say, well, you know, Dave, you're not looking at this right. Unproductive meetings have their purpose in corporate America. There aren't too many people that think that way. And by the way, if I found somebody who liked to hold a lot of unproductive meetings, I wouldn't want them to offer me a job because I wouldn't want to work for them. So I'm willing to talk about some of these negatives only in the sense that they're pretty much negative for everybody. Or here's one. You know what? Well, I think one of the things that I disliked most about my 11 years of my last position was every time there was an economic downturn, it just seemed to have such a significant effect on the shareholders, the employees. There were cutbacks in people. It just had a wet blanket effect on everybody that was involved in the organization. Customers, employees, shareholders, everybody was affected when business went, when we had the recession. Again, pretty undebatable. This is one that you have to be careful where you'd say this, but I think most leaders would agree with this, the ineffective use of voicemail. It always bothered me when I saw employees sitting at their desk, letting phone calls coming in go to voicemail while they were sitting there and could have just as easily answered them. Just a peeve of mine. I mean, you're paid to sit there and answer the phone. If the phone is an inconvenience to you, why do you think we gave you one? If you don't need it, we'll take it out and save the money. So those are some potential answers. Yes, you expose a little bit about your value system, and that's what these are. These are values questions. So just recognize when they start asking about likes and dislikes, they're trying to find out what you value. They're trying to find out the core of who you are. Let's talk about the future questions. These are the long-term motivation questions. This is about your, underline the word, motivation. Listening with our ears and our eyes and our hearts, this is all about what gets you up in the morning. That's really the bottom line. If they're going to have a job that has certain kinds of requirements, duties, responsibilities, deliverables, expectations, are all those things that come with the job, are they going to be something that energizes you or repels you? If they repel you, you're probably the wrong person for the job from the standpoint of the supervisor, and you probably ought to perceive yourself as being the wrong person for the job as well. Is there anybody who wants to be in a job that's totally mismatched with the requirements of the position, and they'd like to be miserable every day and make their boss miserable as long as they could get a nice paycheck? Well, I know the answer to that. Some people would say yes, and they try and get that paycheck. They try and survive in that as long as they could, like a bronc buster on a bronc in a rodeo. You know, let's at least see if we can stay on till the buzzer goes off. The payday's pretty good, even though the fall is really painful. We're going to get questions, future questions like, what are your long-term career goals? Or where do you want to be in another 15 years? Or have you ever thought about career advancement and what that might mean to you? Ultimately, where are you headed in your career or your life, for that matter? Now, I can tell you, as I mentioned earlier in the session, I used to ask every candidate I talked to these long-term motivation questions. And at least 51%, I know over half of all the answers I got for years were basically, I've never really given it much thought. And by the way, those were the easy 51% of the candidates to eliminate. Because I'm not going to hire anybody who hasn't given it much thought, and most managers won't. You may not think it's important, but it is. And I'll tell you why. It's because the job that you'd like to be in ultimately one day, your long-term plans, if you can look at this visually, let's say this is the job where you want to be, and this is where you are now, or where you were in your last job. They just want to see that the job that they've got for you, is it somewhere between where you are and where you're headed, or is the job they have taking you in a different direction? If the job they have takes you away from your long-term goal, they know you're not going to stay in it long because you're not going to have the motivation to do it long. And if it's just a paycheck for many managers, they're not going to hire you for just a paycheck. Oh, there's some that will. There's some that will get what they can get out of you, and it's some employers and employees use each other for a season if they can. But I don't think that's in your best long-term interests. Why not have a job that prepares you for the next job, which then prepares you for the job where you'd like to end the journey? Now, the problem for some of us is we haven't decided where we want to end the journey, which makes answering the question difficult and becomes problematic for managers who want to know where you're headed. So I would encourage you to give it some thought. Maybe not 40 years from now when you plan on stopping working, but I think past next Tuesday. I think past next January. I think past the next couple of years. Here's a kind of an answer that I start with a broad answer, and then as they ask more questions, I might narrow it down. I've thought about my future objectives and the personal needs that I have in my life, And there's three things I need long term. I need to be able to contribute, I need to be able to learn, and I need to be able to keep growing. I do not want to be the same person I am 5, 10, or 15 years from now. I want to be different in 5 and different beyond that in 10 and different beyond that in 15, always. That's how I spent the first 40 years of my career, and if I had 40 more, that's how I'd want to spend the next 40. Always growing, differing, growing, getting better, learning more, continually. I'm just the kind of person, and I know everybody's not like this, but I don't want to continue to do the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. It doesn't have to be bigger, doesn't have to pay more, but it's got to be related to me growing and knowing and being able to continue to improve. We need to think about our future possibilities. What are your future possibilities? When they say, where do you want to be in 15 years, you need to have some kind of a well-prepared, thought-out answer. Again, I'd start general, and if they try and pin you down on specific, you need to have a specific answer. I knew when I was 22 years old that I wanted to be a vice president of human resources by the time I was 40. I knew I wanted to be an HR manager by the time I was 30. I knew that I wanted to be able to retire and move into something outside of corporate America by the time I was 50. Those were major milestones for me. So when asked at 22, at 24, at 27 when I interviewed for a promotion, at 30 when I interviewed for a promotion, those answers didn't change. Let's go into probably the most problematic category of questions for a lot of job seekers, or perhaps most job seekers. And that is the money questions. These are and think about it this way, you might want to write this down because this can help you. These questions are basically all about, are you in the ballpark? They don't need to know the exact penny that you want to make. If they say, tell me about what your expectations are in your next earning, you can give them a range. When somebody asked me what I made in my last job, I would even give them a range there because I didn't make the same income every year. You'll get questions like, what was your income in your last position? What do you expect to make in your next position? What's the least income that you would accept to go to work in a company like ours? Those can be tough questions because you know that if you give the wrong answer, you could be eliminated. Well, let's just put this right up on the table. Most of the time, money questions are asked early in the process for only one purpose, to eliminate you from candidacy. So if you do your research ahead of time and you know what they're paying for the position and you know you're in the ballpark, the best first answer is to say, I just want you to know, I know what you pay for this job. Maybe they posted the range or they posted the exact starting pay on their job board or on their job posting, or you found out by calling someone in the organization and you know that that's in the ballpark. You could just answer it, my pay expectations are right in the ballpark with what you've posted for the job. I'll expect more possibly if the job is bigger than I think it is. I might expect less if the job is smaller than I think it is. You need to leave yourself, when you can in these questions, to try and leave yourself some wiggle room, because whenever you put a specific dollar figure on the table, you've already started salary negotiations before there's even been a job offer made. Let me back up and say, and we'll talk about this when we get to salary and job offer negotiations in a couple more sessions. We're going to spend a good deal of time talking about this, but the short version right now is the best time to talk about salary, your last salary or your next salary, is when they make you a job offer. That's very difficult to avoid, very difficult. I know that. But I do know many people have been successful in avoiding the discussion if you approach it properly. Some of you are going to feel very uncomfortable about this because your first attempt is to not answer the question in this regard. But you're going to tell them why. You have a good reason why. If somebody says, can you, first off, let me back all the way up. Let's say that somebody's looking for your salary history. You know, there are those job postings out there that say, send in your resume with your salary history. This is my own personal view. Some of you won't adopt this, and I don't blame you at all. This is my personal view. I will not give my salary history to anybody I have not yet met face to face. Won't do it. Well, Dave, they just won't let you be a candidate if you don't supply your salary history. It's why I've never tried to get a job on a job posting. I think it's a waste of time. The wrong jobs, gotten the wrong way by the wrong people, hired by the wrong individuals. Well, how do you get your jobs? Well, we talked about that when we talked about networking. 2/3 to 3/4 of all jobs are landed through networking. You don't have to give your salary out before you meet somebody. But if you're relying upon all your famous candidacy to come from a posting or filling out an application online, yeah, you're going to be asked for your salary history every time. I won't give it, period. I don't know what they're going to do with it, and it's very personal information. What I find amazing is there are job candidates on their resume, they won't put their home address down, but they'll put down their last 5 years' salary history. Tell me how that makes sense. Your address is public information. It's in the phone book. It's in the court records if you're a homeowner. And you won't put it on a resume that you're actually deciding who you give it to. But a stranger asks you for your salary history and you divulge to the penny what your W-2 earnings were the last 3 years. I just find that a bit contradictory. Remember why, if we remember we're doing our thinking, when they start to ask these salary questions, what are they really asking about? Do they really want to know your salary? And my answer is, in most cases, no. Here's what they really want to know. They want to know what the risk is in hiring you. Can they pay you enough to keep you and not pay you too much that they can't afford you? Let's use a simple analogy, a simple example. Let's say, for example, you're going to hire somebody to cut your lawn. Now, I've got a lawn man named Guillermo. I've known Guillermo since before he even started his lawn business. Used to be a cook. Retired from his corporate America job where he was a chef and started a lawn business. He's been doing my lawn in my last 2 homes for many, many years. Known him for a long time. We've become good friends. I went to one of his son's weddings, and he and his wife came to one of my son's weddings. I mean, we're more than just homeowner and lawn person. But I'm careful about what I pay Guillermo. I want to pay him enough that he does a good job, but I don't want to pay the most of anybody in my neighborhood. I want the best looking lawn in the neighborhood for the least amount I can pay. I want the best car I can buy for the least amount I have to pay for the car. I want the best gasoline I can put in my car for the least. I'll drive an extra mile to save 10 cents a gallon on a gallon of gas. And employers will, if they can find, they want the best employee they can find for the least amount of money they can pay. It's called capitalism. It's what made this country great. And if you were hiring, you'd pretty much have the same motivation and attitude as well. You don't want to pay people so little that they'll leave, that they won't perform, but you don't want to pay them so much that you can't make an income. I'm not going to pay a lawn man $100 to do my lawn if $25 gives me the best looking lawn in the neighborhood, even if I had the $100. And corporations and companies generally won't do this if they're hiring their labor either. So it's a risk question. What is the risk in offering you what they pay for the job? They want to know that, and if you can, many times you can quell their concern for risk if you can just say, if you could tell me what your pay range is, I can tell you if I'm in the ballpark. Here's how you try and defer the discussion. just like my friend Jim did in the 2 interviews that he had before he got his job offer. Just let them know this. If they're asking, what do you expect to be paid in your next job? You can say it this way: I don't know yet enough about your company and this job requirements. And you don't know yet enough about me and what I did in my last job. Even though the last job I was called a ABC technician, and your job you call them an ABC technician, they may not require the same things. That one job may be considerably bigger than the other. If your job is bigger than the last job, if you're requiring more hours, more commitment, more responsibility, tougher decision making, whatever, I would expect to make more money than I might made in my last job if you're going to ask me to do more work. I might be willing to take a little bit less than I made in my last job if I find out that this job doesn't have near the requirements that I had in my last position, if I'm even interested in a job that requires me to do less. So until you know more about me and I know more about the job, I think money is it's a little early to talk about money. Could we put that off for a bit? You'll be amazed at how, if you go to the trouble, if you say it nicely, if you're not saying it in a confrontational manner, if you're not bowing your neck, if you're not sounding obstinate, if you're not sounding arrogant, you'll be amazed at how many people will defer the compensation discussion. Not all, but many will. If they won't defer, you've got to decide whether the interview's over or whether it's not. And if you decide, well, okay, I'm going to have to give them my expectations, just know that if you're outside of the ballpark because you don't know what the ballpark is, you may have just lost consideration. Or, better yet, if you find out the range is from this to this, and you've told them that what you expect in the job is this amount, this is down near the minimum, and then you find out that other people that have been hired in the job who have the length of experience you have were hired up toward the midpoint, but because you said this is what your expectation were, they heard that and they wrote it down when they asked the question. And you get hired down here, and then two months, 3 months, 6 months, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this. Hey, I'm getting underpaid relative to all the people that are doing the same work. Tough. That's what you said you'd work for. If I was hiring you, that's what I'd hire you for too. The word says, let your yes be yes and your no be no, period. So you need to know as much as you can know before you start giving the answers. How about the questions that you don't expect? See, there's going to be some questions that kind of come out of nowhere. Questions that you didn't expect at all. Do you hear about when Aggie went to heaven? And he met St. Peter at the gates. And St. Peter said, well, it's getting a little crowded up here. Believe it or not, it's getting crowded up here, and we've had to institutionalize an entrance exam. He said, really? He said, yeah. He said, it's got 3 questions, and it's an open book exam, and you can study. We'll give you the questions ahead of time. You can study, and then come back, but you have to get all 3 questions correct. Aggie said, great, I love entrance exams. And so he said, okay, what are the 3 questions? Write them down, and then you come back when you're ready to answer. So the first question is, he said, I want you to tell me how many days of the week and what they are begin with the letter T. Aggie writes it down. Question number 2 is a math question. How many seconds are there in a year? Aggie writes it down. Third question, what is God's first name? Aggie writes it down. He says, I'll be back. He's gone for a long time. Finally comes back. St. Peter says, are you ready for the exam? He says, I am ready. He says, I am fully ready. He says, I know all 3 of the answers to these questions. I'm ready to come into heaven. St. Peter says, fine. He says, tell me, what are the 2, he says, how many days of the week begin with the letter T, and what are they? He said, 2. St. Peter raised his eyebrows. 2. He said, yeah, today and tomorrow. St. Peter said, well, you got the number right. You didn't really get what I was thinking, but you're not incorrect either. I'll give you credit for that one. I probably wasn't real clear. Let's go on to the math question. How many seconds are there in a year? Well, the Aggie said, this was a little bit tougher, but he said, I figured it out. 12. He said 12. He said, yeah, January 2nd, February 2nd, March 2nd, April 2nd. St. Peter shaking his head at this point. He said, 12? He said, that's not what I meant. He said, but I guess, again, I wasn't very clear. I probably could have asked the question better. I'll give you credit for that one, too. It's not a wrong answer. You got to get this third one right, though. What is God's first name? Aggie said that was the easiest question of all. He said, God's first name is Andy. St. Peter said, I beg your pardon? His first name is Andy? He said, yes, Andy. He said, what do you mean his first name is Andy? He said, I learned this when I was a kid at Sunday school. Every Sunday we sang, Andy walks with me, Andy talks with me. His name's Andy. Now, sometimes you get those kind of questions you don't expect, and so you kind of give right answers that aren't right answers. Remember all the questions that we get, and some of them are going to throw you. You probably won't go through too many interviews where you don't get questions that throw you. Perhaps not what is the first name of God, but you're going to get questions that can be equally confounding. Remember, first we want to listen with care. We want to think what their purpose is in asking the question. What is the motivation behind the question? Why would they want the answer to this? If you think about that just momentarily, it can cause you to rephrase your answer, particularly to these unexpected questions. And then you can speak with impact. How about the illegal questions? How about the rude questions? How about the inappropriate questions? We have a handout in our manual. I don't want you to turn there now, but just make a mental note of it. It's handout 9.2. It's called Interview Questions. It's a 2-page handout. There's 50-some questions that are here. These were real-life questions that came from one interviewer to one of our job seekers in Career Solutions Workshop. And she documented every question. Some of them are illegal, some of them are blatantly inappropriate and rude. There's only a few good questions in the whole group. She brought them to me and she said, Dave, would you rather, should I sue them? I said, no. I said, the first thing you need to find out is, what are they trying to get out of these questions? What's their motivation? What is the purpose in asking? And the second thing you need to find out is, particularly for these legal questions, like they want to know whether you're married, single, divorced, or widowed. They want to know your exact date of birth. They want to know the exact date you graduated from. Yeah, those are inappropriate questions. But you want to find out whether, is this some sort of systemic problem inside of this, because this is a pretty large organization, or is this just one ill-trained, undertrained, misinformed interviewer, inexperienced, who didn't have a clue? There's no ill-intentioned motivation. They're not trying to eliminate you with illegal information. The person that asked the question may not even know that some of these are illegal. I'm telling you, just as an old HR person, that there are some people, unfortunately, given the interview responsibility, that don't have any training in what they're supposed to be doing. So get the answer to my questions before you start going off the deep end with your concerns. Well, Nancy went back. She found out that this was a brand new interviewer, never trained, thrown in at the last minute because Nancy had driven from here all the way to Tyler to interview for this job, and they didn't want to send her home without having an interview, so they put some novice person in there. Terrible questions. You read them. I mean, they're just, some of them are well, it's in your manuals. Handout 9.2. Nancy ended up going to work there. Now, when you get illegal or inappropriate questions, here's my advice. And this is the best advice that I can give you, and I can't think of too many exceptions to this. Let them know. Let's say they ask you a question, inappropriate. Are you married? Do you have any children? Do you have problems with child care? What's your age? You cannot make a hiring decision in the United States of America based upon somebody's age, as long as they're over the age of, I think the minimum age of 17 or 18. And as long as they're under the maximum age. Now, there are maximum ages set for some jobs, like airline pilots have to retire at a certain age, and they won't hire people over. So, and the U.S. military will not hire active duty personnel over a certain age. So there are some bona fide age qualifications in some positions, but not many. But if you get that inappropriate question, back to the point, say it this way: I'd be happy to answer your question, but can you tell me first, why is that information important to your interview and your hiring decision? Get them to answer that question for you. And just say you're happy. First off, if they want to know your age and they eliminate you for your age, the first question I know that some of you, especially if we're in the United States of America, we have attorneys on every street corner. Be careful the way I say this. We have attorneys that would love your business, okay? But I can also tell you as a professional who's been around the equal employment opportunity law for the last almost 50 years now, there are very few people that get eliminated on some of the things we're talking about here who file a lawsuit who get anything. The attorneys may get some money. You might get something after 10 years, but you've just wasted 10 years of your life because your focus is over here instead of focused on your career. I'm going to suggest what the Apostle Paul taught us on his missionary journeys. If you're not wanted somewhere, dust your feet off and move on. Why would you want to work somewhere where they didn't want you, regardless of whether the reason was legal or not? That would be my first question. Why would you want to work for an employer who illegally hires people? Why? You're not going to change their culture by yourself, even if you win a lawsuit. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and there are probably some that would disagree with that, and that's fine. Here's what the foundation that I come from, and this takes a little bit of practice, admittedly. You have to think of this consciously, maybe even write it down somewhere where you can see it before you go out and interview. When you get questions which appear to be off the wall, inappropriate, or even bordering on legality, I always think of it this way. How would Jesus Christ answer the question? Even if he gave an answer which was a contrary answer, I think in most of the cases he would do it in love, particularly if it was not meant or asked maliciously. Now, if my background were disparaged and I was called every name under the sun, I might have a hard time loving them with my response. And the Lord does tell us we're supposed to love our enemies. Sometimes that's hard. But I just ask myself the question, how might Jesus answer the question? And I think in many cases, he gives us the example in his word. He would answer a question with a question. Tell me why that's important to you. Tell me why you would even ask that question. Be happy to answer your question, but tell me what you're driving at. And many times the question that was asked evaporates. It goes away. Especially if a light goes on in their head that they've just asked something, they've tread in an area that was totally inappropriate in the first place. Okay, now how about, and that's how you deal with those categories of questions, some of the tougher questions. Admittedly, I want you to go back through your books, Finding a Job God's Way. And we talk about this in those interview chapters. Make sure you get prepared to answer them. This is all about preparation. The way that you have impactful answers in an interview is in your preparation, not in hearing what you just heard in this session, but it's now as you prepare for each interview, learning about the employer, what they value, what's important to them, what's required, what the credentials are, et cetera, et cetera. And then that's tailored. First you learn about the employer, and then you learn about the requirements specific to the job. And if you can, then you learn about the nuances specific to the hiring manager for that job. Because there might be 3 supervisors all in the accounts payable department, and all 3 supervisors have a little bit different way in which they like to run their part of the business. Even though the job descriptions for everybody that works for the 3 of them are all the same. You get where I'm going with that. All right, now, at some point, we're going to be asked, these are almost like bookend questions. The first most important question you're going to get in an interview is, tell me about yourself, which is really not a question, it's a request. The next most important question you're going to get usually is at the end. Sometimes it'll pop out right in the middle, but usually it's at the end, and it's usually something like this. Do you have any questions for me? And let me tell you what the worst answer to that question is. No! Don't ever say that. Don't ever say that. Now, And I try and give people some of the most extreme examples to drive my point home. Let's say that you have 5 interviews in the same company. And each time you interview with somebody different and they ask you at the end of the year, do you have any questions about the company or about the job? You better have questions to ask. Let me go even one more extreme case. Let's say you interview 5 times with the same person, and at the end of each one of those, they say, do you have any questions for me? You better have questions to ask. Now, let me tell you the most important reason why you ought to have questions, because you think it's something different, I know. That's the second reason. The second reason is so that you let them know that you're interested, that you show a level of interest, and that you've done some homework about the company, the job, the person, and so forth. But here's the first reason. And most job seekers just, well, I won't say most, many totally ignore this motivation. The most important reason you need to ask questions is so that if you get a job offer, you have the information that you need to be able to intelligently, to be able to confidently say yes or no, to accept the job or not. Because every job offer you get, I don't care whether you've been out of work 6 months, 16 months, or 26 months. The first job offer you get is not necessarily a job offer from God. It may be the wrong job. It may be the wrong organization. But some of us get so desperate that we're willing to say yes to anything. I'll never forget Sharon, always used to sit in the front of the class. She got really desperate. She had been out of work for a long time. And right after, we haven't talked about negotiations, that'll come in a couple of weeks, so I may tell this story again inadvertently. But the very first employer that finally offered her a job, she didn't remember anything I taught in negotiations. She said yes, she took the job. And she was miserable for months and finally left in misery. Then you end up with another short-term job on your resume, and it makes your resume look even worse than being unemployed. So we've got questions that we need to ask. And I kind of break the questions down into categories because a lot of people will say, well, I don't know what questions to ask. Think about if you categorize things, it's so much easier. The first suggestion I'm going to make is that you ask questions about the stuff that you know you need to know, and that you ask questions that will help you better accept or not accept a job offer, and that you ask questions that you don't yet have answers to, but these questions popped up as a result of your preparing for the interview, of your result of your interview research, talking with others and so forth. And here's the categories. You're probably going to have questions about, number one category, the job itself. What are the duties of the job? What are requirements of the job? What are some of the tough parts of the job? What are some of the obstacles that you face in the job? How many times have you had to fill this job? What's the turnover been like in this job? What are some of what are the things that cause some people to succeed or fail in this job? You could easily have 25 questions just about the job, but I'm going to give you a second category. How about questions about the company, the bigger organization? How long has this company been around? Based upon what I saw on your website, you're the number 2 in the industry. What are your plans to become number 1? I noticed that you're opening some new offices and facilities here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. What are the plans for growth beyond that? So you ask all about the organization, its structure, where is it headquartered, the things that you know. I noticed that you're headquartered in Boston. Does that mean that you need to have sort of a Boston work ethic to succeed in this company, even if you're hired in Texas? What's the autonomy like from the Texas office to the Boston? Does everybody that works in Texas have to take a stint in Boston to succeed in this company? Are all the good paying jobs in Boston? I mean, there's 100 ways you might, but you're getting the gist of this. So you ask questions that understand better about the company. That's the second category. Probably have 20 or 25 questions about the company. How about questions about the people? You got questions about the job, questions about the company. How about questions about the people you're going to work with? Peers, supervisors, if you're going to be hired in a management job, people that are going to be on your team, your staff. Turnover kinds of questions. What do you look for in people? What are What are the numbers of employees compared to what they were 5 years ago? What do you guys project? Again, some of these categories sort of overlap, but you've got lots of people questions. You want to find out what some of the behavioral norms are in the organization. If there's flex time, you find out that when you're asking company questions, they have flex time. People can work 8 hours anytime between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. You can work your 8-hour shift. You might have questions about who decides how often you can change that. Can you do it daily, weekly, monthly? Do you have to let people know ahead of time what hours you're going to work, or you just show up and work your 8 hours? All kinds of great questions. You might have 15, 20, 25 questions just about people. Okay, the boss, the job, the company, the people. How about questions about the boss? If you're interviewing with HR, you ask the HR people about the hiring manager. When you're interviewing with the hiring manager, you ask the hiring manager about the hiring manager. I'm going to give you one example. I think this is one of the best questions you can ask. Please don't try and get this in my verbatim, and do not ask me to repeat this. Get the spirit of the question and put it in your words, please. But I think this is one of the most powerful questions any job applicant could ask any boss. What is it, if you hired me in this job, what is it I could do in the next 6 to 9 months that would make your job much easier? Because most candidates are asking, what are you going to do for me if I come to work here? How soon do I get to start my vacation time? Tell me about the dental plan. If all your questions are about you, you're missing the boat. Remember what I said last week? I'll reiterate it again because it's worth repeating. The interview is not about you. It's about the company. It's about the boss. It's about the other person. And how you fit with them, how you serve them, what you can do for them, how you can make that. They're only hiring you for one reason. They have a need that needs to be accomplished. Are you the answer to their needs? Not are they the answer to your needs. They don't care how long you've been out of work. They don't care whether you're paying your rent or not. They don't care what kind of teeth you got and how good their dental plan might service your rotten teeth. That is not their part of their motivation. Oh, I'm not saying that they aren't good people and they're not happy to help you with those benefits, but that is not why they're going to hire you. They do not have an objective that I know of in any company where they're trying to get all the unemployed people working. That's not their objective. Their objective is to hire the best person they can to fill the job need that exists. So your questions need to recognize that. I want to suggest that you prepare these questions, that you write them down. One more category of questions, the future. They've asked you about what you want in the future. You ask them about the future of the organization. When people were interviewing with the Enron Corporation some years ago, a few years before they went under, if more people asked more questions, either they might not have gone under or people that went to work there might not have taken jobs there. I don't know enough about it, so that's purely speculation when I say it that way. But the point is, we need to be asking a lot of questions so we don't make mistakes. Ask about the future. What are the plans for the future? I have an interest in learning every year. What do you do for purposes of people in terms of their career progression? What is the role of the company in people growing their career and moving ahead? And what are the likely career progression steps for somebody in the job that I'm going to be taking? Great questions to ask because now they're long-term, future-motivated kinds of questions. They know you're not just looking for a job for a paycheck next week, that you're thinking longer term. That will endear you to many employers. Not that all jobs are going to last a long time, but at least they know you're not going to be taking a job so that you can leave next week. So your best questions are going to give you the information that you need based upon the research that you've done in these kinds of categories. And I would get at least 5 questions in every category or more. And as I said, many of these categories would drive many, many more questions. Then what you do is you key these questions into a Word document. Leave a little space between each one. So maybe you print 8 or 10 questions on a page. Keep your questions brief. They shouldn't be 4 paragraphs long. Keep your questions brief. Leave a little space so when you ask when they say, do you have any questions for me? Your first response is, yes, I do. You open your portfolio, you open your notebook, you open your purse, Wherever you've got your questions and you say, yes, I do, and they see that they're typed out, that they're printed, that you've brought them with you, you've left some space so you can write the salient points of their answers down without trying to capture verbatim everything they say. I can't tell you the power that that approach has in an interview. It's powerful. It shows interest and preparation. I don't know a recruiter or a hiring manager that isn't impressed with it, and I'll tell you why. Because most job seekers don't do it. It would never have occurred to me since I was 22 years old not to go in there with it. That's why they knew I was going to be a good interviewer candidate. I prepared my questions in advance. They knew I was going to be a good employment interviewer. I don't go into an interview without being prepared, whether I'm on one side of the table or the other. Because remember what we said last week, when you're interviewing for a job, you're also interviewing the employer for an employer. It's a two-way street. They're interviewing you, you're interviewing them, and therein lies the success in a good marriage. Whether it's a marriage between a man and a woman or a marriage between a boss and a subordinate. And in many cases, we spend more time with our boss than we do with our spouse. Amen. Again, I want to draw your attention without you having you flip over there right now, but in handout 9.3, I have 10 sample questions. Now, I'm almost sorry I put these in the manual, because my friend Wayne, when he interviewed for a job many years ago, we've had this handout in the book almost since the beginning. He sent me a testimonial after he landed a job, and his testimonial read something like this. I'm going to paraphrase. He said, David, he said, I want you to know that your idea of having your questions ready when you're in an interview worked perfect. When they asked me if I had any questions, I asked your question number 6, which, by the way, reads, what are the most important characteristics for this candidate to be successful? He said, that really just knocked their socks off that I had that question for them. I mean, it's a pretty simple question. I wrote an email back to Wayne. I said, Wayne, you're supposed to ask your questions, not mine. Make up your own questions. Well, see, he hadn't prepared his questions in advance, so pulling this handout out, this was sort of his last-ditch effort, his last-ditch stop. One final thing before we get into any questions amongst the group here, and that's this. Once you're done with the interview and you're done with your questions, remember what I said last week. You want to make sure that you go out, write your thank you notes, mail your thank you notes, do any other follow-up if they're looking for references or any of that stuff. You do all of that even before you leave the parking lot or the street where you've parked before you drive home. Do it while the interview is fresh. Evaluate your interview based upon that evaluation form we talked about last week in the last section of the book. Evaluate how well you did. If you made a commitment to send your references, make a note in your somewhere so that you don't forget to do that. And when you get home, you send those references. Take your thank you note stuff with you. Take the thank you note cards. Your pen, a good pen. Make sure you ask for their business card before you leave the interview. Make sure you take your postage stamps with you, so when you sit in the car, you write your quick little 15-word thank you note. Thanks for the time you gave me. I really appreciate this. I know you're very busy, but I really appreciate the extra time that you took with me today. I look forward to hearing from you within the 2 weeks that you mentioned. Signed, Dave. Handwritten. Stick it in the envelope, stick a stamp on it. You pull their card out, address it carefully. You don't want misspelled names, misspelled companies, or any of that. You put it's stamped, you seal it up, and you mail it in the closest mailbox to the company. Why? So they get it tomorrow. That'll impress them for 2 reasons. 1, they know you mailed it that day. 2, you're going to be one of very few people that send a thank you note. Guaranteed. Matter of fact, I can tell in any group of 50 or 100 people, that there won't be more than 5 or 10 people that basically get into the habit of writing thank you notes after the interview. I'm saddened by that. Some people just don't value the process. I mean, it used to just be the courteous thing to do. You wouldn't have thought not to write a thank you note. Now most people, even when they're told how valuable it is, won't do it because it becomes an inconvenience. Okay, so that's what we put in our thank you letter. Now, for preparation next week, we're going to be doing practice interviewing. We've now talked about interviewing for 2 weeks. We're going to have an opportunity to break into small groups and do some practice interviewing. We're going to demonstrate some interviews up here on the stage. And so I want you to come prepared, get through all of your interviewing materials in advance. Bring some copies of your resume if you have those, because they can help you in this process. It's very important that we finish strong in this 3 sections on interviewing. So don't drop the ball now, show up. Now, I want to make a special request that you do some homework for this next session, in just what I asked for. Read the sections on interviewing in the book, in the manual, look at your handouts, get your resumes prepared, and show up on time as we have been doing every one of our sessions. I'm really excited now as we're sort of in the downhill of this as we move into session 10 out of 12 next week. Okay, interviewing. Bring 3 copies of your resume and we'll be all ready to go for I think next week is probably one of the most fun weeks that we have in the entire 12-week curriculum. Okay, let me pray and we'll adjourn for this session. Father, thank you so much for each of these that have come tonight. Lord, I just ask that you would bless their efforts to come and learn what you would have them do, what you would have them say as they prepare for their interviews. Father, give them the focus and the energy and the purpose to go through the preparatory steps so that they can interview with great impact. Whether they have 10 or 20 or 50 interviews, Lord, give them the power in each and every one. You know the job that's out there for each of these people. You already know where it is. And Father, we just ask that you would be a lamp unto their feet, that you would lead them step by step as they do their part, as they get up, as they get dressed, as they step out in faith, that you would lead them step by step to the organization and the job that you have planned for them. Be with them now, give them peace and joy in this next week, and prepare them for our next session. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.